Before I call it a wrap on the whole Gondola series and start working on something else, I want to highlight a couple more things. As I talked about in other videos, I used the primer to give the piece sort of a uniform texture, as well as to pick out any problem areas or anything that needs a little bit of extra work. But one of the things I sort of discovered is that if you hit it with the fine end of the sanding sponge and then give it a polish with just a normal dish rag, this one in particular was just bought from the dollar store, you can actually give it a much smoother, shinier quasi-gloss, which, depending on what you're making, can be nice. Just because otherwise it's a little bit hard to keep everything completely smooth and polished. But in this case, I believe it was a light gray Rust-Oleum. I don't know if it was automotive, but it was a filler primer, which is usually just a little bit thicker than some other primers. But a couple coats of that, and then the whole process of you prime it, you let it dry, you sand it, and smooth it out. But hitting it with the dish towel there helps to sort of clean out and even out the texture, so it has a nice, smoother, more professional look to it. Wouldn't recommend doing this on absolutely everything, as the kind of matte, rough, faintly rough texture of primer can be nice for holding paint, and it is worth pointing out that silicone will pick up every little bit of texture. It'll pick up bits of texture that you didn't even notice were there. But that's just something I wanted to highlight, just because I don't think I did take the time to sort of talk about the cleaning and smoothing process. But let's move on to the next little bit of something, which I just thought this was interesting, and you might find it useful to know for things you might make later on. Now with this part, I wasn't doing anything too special in terms of pouring the resin, but what I wanted to demonstrate was that you could sort of use those air channels that were made while casting with the dowel rods in the mold as a sort of air pump. So what those normally do is those allow the air to be pushed out from the bottom of the mold out and up, and typically those will fill with resin and you'll end up with essentially dowel rod sprues. Typically kind of a waste of resin, especially when it goes all the way to the top and starts kind of pouring out the side. So what I started doing was kind of plugging those holes back up so I don't waste as much resin. But what I realized you could do is use those to kind of control the level of the resin. So you could sort of pull them up and pull some of the resin down into the mold so it's not overflowing on the top. Or if you're a little low on resin, you could push those back down in and raise the resin back on top through the main pour hole and not have to pour a second batch of resin or end up with a big air bubble right at the top there. So just something interesting to keep in mind, and since I do intend to keep using that sort of air channels method in other molds, it's a useful thing to do. But that actually kind of also plays into the next thing I want to show you. Now this is based off the same idea. If you're working with very small molds like I am, and you're only using these small, what they call trial kits of resin, you can sometimes find yourself in a situation where you're down to the last drop of resin and it is not enough to fill up a mold. Or you could be very short on resin, or you could know that you need to use so much for a separate project and you're trying to save it. So what I was trying to demonstrate here is a use for all of those extra little leftover sprues. The little white rods, as you can see them up in the top right corner there. Now, these are usually just garbage. You can throw them out, you can just get rid of them. They don't have a use, they're just a little bit of wasted material. But as I had mentioned before, resin tends to bond to resin pretty nicely. So if you have a minor blemish in one of your castings that you need to repair, like I sometimes do, you can take the little bits of leftover resin from another batch and kind of dab it onto, say, a little air bubble, or you know, somewhere where something got stuck in the mold and you had to chip it out. There are other filler materials you can use depending on the nature of the project you're working on, but I want to stop this right here because I'm about to pour it, and I want you to look at this and ask yourself, what did I do wrong? Because I did something very wrong here. More specifically, I didn't do something. I measured my stuff out, I poured it into a separate cup, I measured the part B out, which is the gooier part, and mixed it up in the smaller mixing cup so it would pick up the remnants of the part A. And then I poured it into that cup, and I poured that straight into the mold. Have you figured it out yet? I didn't mix my resin. I did not mix it at all. Which, that's going to be a problem, and you'll see what happens, but we'll come back to that in a second. So, what I wanted to demonstrate here was something you can kind of do when you know you're short on resin, but you've also got, say, a pile of sprues and leftover bits of casting material. So, I hit this with a power sander, vibrate around, make sure it gets into all the fine crevices and everything, which bites me in the ass later. Snap a couple rubber bands, because that just happens. Always handy to have a few more around, just in case. You've also noticed I've got little wooden supports, just because that helps hold the mold all in one clean shape. Now, doing the little air channel pump thing, this is just, oh no, I haven't poured enough material. And I did this on purpose. I poured, it's normally about 1 1/4 fluid ounce. So I poured 1 fluid ounce to show, oh no, I'm short on resin. What do I do? Well, I've got those air channels in there. I can kind of pump a little bit more of the material back in. Then you get these piles of sprues, which you just sort of wiggle them into the mold, because the resin will bond to itself. And the mold isn't so soft that having something in there is going to be poking out at a weird angle. It's all going to kind of bond into one piece. It's important that you do this with the same type of resin that you've used before. And I suppose it should go without saying that I don't suggest doing this with everything. This is sort of a last-ditch, you know, oh crap moment sort of thing. I'm short on resin, what do I do? This mold isn't going to fill, and I've got nothing else to fill it with. Well, before it's cured, you can throw in, I just snapped up the little sort of resin rods that I had been accumulating and wiggled them in there. And just a little bit at a time, added more and more and more until the mold was filled enough to the top. And now, this would have worked had I mixed the resin. And to some extent, vibrating it around with the hand sander there did help, but it did not stop my terrible, terrible mistake from happening. So let's skip ahead to that part. So here I am, poking at my mold. This is about an hour later. I let this sit for a while just to be safe. And the first thing I notice is that the top is still gooey. My initial thought was, did I not mix this right? Did I have a little bit more part A than part B? And then I open it and it's gooey. I've got about half a gondola in there. It kind of goes to about his knees and then it just turns to mush. And that's very bad. So I throw on my gloves and get ready to do some work. After pulling him out of the mold and pulling everything apart, you can see the inside is still sticky and goopy with the part B of the 2-part resin. What I ended up having to do here is I poked around at it a lot with Q-tips, pulling out all the gunk from the fine materials, but a little bit at a time I would mix, say, like 1/8 of an ounce of resin, slosh it around in there as much as I could, let it set, then do it again and again and again until the mold was filled. And eventually I was able to pull out enough to clean out the mold and make it usable again. My castings after that are fine, but this is a warning to you, because doing this is potentially very bad. It's not going to permanently ruin a mold, but it'll slow you down, because this is a pain in the ass to clean out the inside of a mold, especially if it's full of all kinds of little nooks and crannies. So I think we're just going to fast forward here so you can get a good look at the gooey gondola. Since all I'm doing here is mixing up small amounts of resin and attempting to clean out the mold. It's not all that interesting. As you can see, the gooey gondola is gooey. He's soft to the touch. You can deform him easily with your hands, even though he's been out of the mold for hours. He's got that sort of slimy residue on him, which is the leftover resin mix. The color of the resin's all messed up. This other one here, this is the clean out casting. This is little bits of resin poured in and sloshed around the mold a little bit at a time. But ultimately, it's a good thing that his legs snapped off, because it meant that the resin was fully curing and that the outer layers were also hardening properly. So that's good. But these are just... I wanted to share my mistakes with you, because these are things that can happen. Once you start to get into sort of a rhythm, it's very easy to miss a step and not realize it until much later, because you're just doing business as usual. When you're casting dozens and dozens of little guys off these molds, it's very easy to make a mistake and not realize it. So I'm going to be keeping these guys around. I'll find somewhere to put them, and they will be my sad, sad reminder of that time I messed up really badly. But I figured you might want to at least see this, because it's entertaining in a very sad sort of way. But thanks for watching as usual. Hopefully this was educational. Hopefully this was a cautionary tale that you will learn from if you go forward and do some resin casting of your own. The little air channel thing, using that to sort of pump resin back into the mold, maybe you'll find that. I think that can be very useful. And not letting all those little extra sprues and little bits of resin that you chop off go to waste could come in handy, could save your life. Well, could save your project at least. Either way, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, tell your grandma. Follow me on social media things, all linked in the description. And I think I might have one more gondola video in me, because I do still have to paint these guys. So maybe you'll find that interesting, and we'll talk about that in the next video. So until then, thanks for watching.